Flow Unleashed.
Do you feel that your mindset and mental ability is your greatest asset? And if not, why not? Welcome to Flow Unleashed. I'm Dr. Cameron Norsworthy, scientist and high-performance coach to multiple world champions. In this show, we unpack key insights on specific topics so that you are kept up to date with the latest science and practice of human performance. Imagine the day you've been waiting for, training for, and dreaming about is finally here. Over the past few days, your nerves have been on the rise. You're both excited and nervous. You just want the event to be over. You didn't sleep that well last night as you kept thinking about today. And you haven't been able to eat much either. You can't get your mind off the upcoming event. How will it play out? How will you perform? What will others think of you and your results? What will happen if you fail? Would all the hard work be worth it if I don't get the results that I want? Tick, tock. The minutes and hours pass in a glacial manner. Finally, you've arrived. You're a few minutes away from going on, but the butterflies are fluttering around your belly, trickling into your chest. A spike of anxiety rushes through your veins, sending your head racing with anything but the first steps of your performance that you know you need to focus on. Your heart rate is increasing, and your palms are beginning to sweat. You start to have second thoughts. Doubt enters the mind. Why am I here? I'm not meant to do this. Surely there is someone better suited to do this. Why did I say yes? We've all been there and experienced this inner turmoil before an important event. Whether it is a speech, competitive sporting match, meeting presentation, musical performance, exam, or even going out on a date, the days and moments before an important event can make us squirm and send us crazy. It is at these precise times that our body physiologically enters a fight, flight, freeze, or flow situation, determining whether we make a fool of ourselves or live to remember an amazing performance. Do we tighten up and grit our way through it, giving a wooden subpar performance of ourselves? Or do we pull the ripcord and exit at the earliest possible chance? Do we allow the anxiety to get the better of ourselves and fumble through the event? Or do we grab hold of this arousal and leapfrog into flow? What often determines our response when it matters most is whether we have done our mental training. What makes the biggest difference of all is whether we have proactively trained our mind to deal with moments such as this. Do we get distracted by the noise in our heads and the flutters in our body? Or do we choose to direct our attention towards a point of focus that we have rehearsed to guide us into an optimal state of functioning? One individual who has both personal and professional experience in using the mind to engineer an optimal performance when it matters is our guest, Dr. Anna Waters. Anna has a PhD in applied psychology and over 25 years of practical experience in performance psychology, working with many of the UK's national sporting and performing institutions, such as the British Olympic Association, UK Athletics, and National Ballet Companies. I'm delighted to invite Anna to the show. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks, Cameron. It's lovely to be here. I've been looking forward to coming and talking to you today, so it's a pleasure to be here.
What does optimal or peak performance look like to you?
Yeah, so for me, I think when you talk about peak performance, I've got sort of 25 years of working in the field of performance psychology. And for me, peak performance is when somebody is able to really tap into all their resources, so to be fully engaged with their performance. So I think often we think of peak performance as perhaps being something like somebody winning a gold medal or some sort of really high level performance. But I think what I've really learned over the years is, for me, peak performance is when you have an athlete or a person performing in any context, and they are able to really fully engage with that performance and tap into 100% of the resources available to them on that day. That for me is really peak performance. So a good example that springs to mind for me is, if we think back to the last Olympics in Tokyo, I worked with quite a few athletes up to the Tokyo Olympics, and a few did extremely well and won medals. But the one performance that always stands out to me is an athlete that I've worked with for probably about 6 years, and they'd worked really hard to get a place at the Olympics. And they put everything into their training and preparation. And really on the day when they came to perform, everything just came together. And they delivered a massive PB. And when I can still picture his face coming out the arena, this sort of beaming smile, the pride in himself for having been able to deliver just at the right moment. And then when you look slightly to the side and saw the scoreboard, he'd actually come like a million miles last. There was no medal contender, but for him, he had delivered everything he could on that day. And that for me, still, when I think of the Tokyo Olympics, I think of his smile and the fact that he was so proud, even though in the press people picked up on the fact he was miles away from a medal and things like that. But he was able to focus and deliver and not be distracted with fears or thinking about medaling or all these other distractions that can be so hard to manage and deal with.
Yeah, I love that separation of the outcome and the results from that personal performance, and that space that we might get in where we actualize our own ability, regardless of what that means subjectively to a judge or what that means on the scoreboard, and being able to be in that kind of optimal state of functioning by the sounds of it. And you started as a jockey.
I did, yeah. Yeah, so growing up, I was very into horse riding, and I had a pony and competed in sort of show jumping and dressage and cross country. But when I was about 14, I read a book about a girl becoming a jockey, and much to my parents' frustration, I decided that's what I wanted to be. And they did support me, but made sure I stayed at school to do my A-levels, again, to my frustration at the time. But yeah, I took myself off to Newmarket at the age of 18 and spent 6 years working in the world of horse racing. When I progressed up from being a stable girl to an apprentice jockey, and then also was able to travel all over the world. So I lived in 6 different countries and was very often the only girl as well riding. So it was a really challenging situation. But I think it really taught me what it's like to actually have to earn your living as a professional sports person. You've got to pay the bills, you've got to be able to perform, you've got to be able to deliver. And as a woman as well, or as a young lady at that time, again, but often I was up against all the male jockeys having to fight for getting right in the races, as well as being on a sort of even par with them in the race as well. So I think it really taught me how to be resilient and how to be able to adapt to lots of different situations and be challenged and have to deliver in sort of very high pressured situations. And it also really got me interested in what sports psychology is, because I started looking at some of the other riders around me, and I noticed how, if you look around the stable yard, all the people looking after the horses were all people that at one point probably had wanted to be a jockey, but hadn't quite made it. And I started thinking, some of these riders are so talented, such brilliant riders, and so good at training the horses. But when they'd been put into a race context or had to perform under pressure, they often just didn't have the mental resources or skills to be able to deliver. And so that got me to start to think, what's going on here? What's this connection between how we actually perform and what's going on in our minds, and what can we actually start to do to understand that and help people to be able to manage these challenges or be able to perform under pressure. Because I often notice like the top jockeys, if you'd see them in a race, often if you'd see them training the horses, they were perhaps a bit lazy, but you'd put them into a race, and the bigger the race, the better they often perform. So there seemed to be people that had this natural ability to deliver under pressure, and a lot of people that really struggled to be able to perform.
Yeah, fascinating. And that must have been such a interesting journey competing as a minority. And I'm imagining there's a whole cultural complexity there that you must have had to navigate through. And do you believe when looking at those jockeys that ability to perform under pressure was talent or nurtured or learned?
I think a bit of both, probably. Some people just have that natural inclination or understanding or ability to perform. And I think, again, some people naturally, like that pressure. I'm sort of one of those people that I like to be put under, I thrived in that situation because I like to be put under pressure. And I remember even when I was at school, my teachers used to, if I wrote an essay and had the weekend to do it, I'd hand something in that was mediocre. But if I was in an exam and I had to do it in half an hour and get it done, I would be able to deliver. So I think for a lot of people, sometimes that pressure is what you need to be able to deliver at the highest level. And other people, it's overwhelming or too much.
And what are some of the common issues and challenges performers come to you with when wanting to perform at that optimal level, but perhaps struggle to do so day in and day out?
Yeah, I think one of the most common factors, because I work with sports people, but also performers on the stage and in a sort of whole array of different domains. But one of the key areas that people come to see me for is often about sort of that. Well, often performers on the stage will come see me and they'll say, I've got really bad stage fright, or I've got anxiety about performing on stage. And the same in sport, getting nervous before performing. And that's often, I always think you have to look at that, what's going on there, because sometimes people are just trying to address that fear or that anxiety sort of superficially. But for me, it's about understanding why you feel anxious. So if somebody comes to me and says, I've been having panic attacks, and I've had performers come in to see me who've been lying in a ball on the side of the stage, unable to get up and perform. They've been so anxious. And it's really important to, you have to understand what's behind that. And sometimes people just say, calm down or relax or it'll be okay. But it's so you've got to really understand what's going on for that performer, what's causing that anxiety. And often it comes back to a fear or a belief or a pattern of behavior that you always get nervous before you perform and it can escalate. Or a lot of, I'd say one of the key sort of fears or unhelpful beliefs that I come across is that sort of worry about being good enough. I was just working with a performer a few weeks ago who again came to see me saying they had really bad stage fright and wanted to address strategies just to help with that. And it, within a couple of sessions, it became clear that actually it was this concern about being good enough that was making them feel so anxious about stepping out on stage. So I think in that, a lot of people, if you think about somebody presenting, doing a presentation at work or going for an interview, again, we have these natural sort of fears often of what are people going to think? I need to fit in. I need to be good enough. I'm going to be judged. And it's about tapping down into that and thinking, actually, what is that fear? Where's that come from? And then learning strategies and replacing that with something that's more helpful as well. And then learning strategies to be able to manage.
So let's say someone came to you and discussed that anxiety of going out onto that big stage. I'm anxious, I get nervous, my body tightens up and my mind starts racing and I struggle to kind of focus on my lines or the actual point in front of me or the presentation I need to give. And you uncover that they've got some unhelpful belief. Perhaps they've linked the outcome with their self-worth. And if I fail, I won't be worthy. Or perhaps they generally don't feel good enough and their self-esteem is low, or whatever sort of scenario that may present itself, how would you help them? What would be your process to helping them?
Yeah, I think what I always do is, first of all, with any client or performer that I'm working with, is look at actually how do they want to be as a performer. So a lot of us spend all our lives saying, I don't want to be anxious. I don't want to be overwhelmed. I don't want to forget my lines. I don't want to stumble over the finish line. I don't want to miss the hurdle in a race. And actually, my starting point with everybody is always, actually, how do you want to be as a performer? What's important to you? Do you want to be confident, focused? And I don't give people those qualities. I will work with people to help them find what's important to their performance. And even if they're quite new to a sport or performing on the stage, they do know, people know what they need, and that will change. Sometimes it's not always I had a performer I was working with recently, a musician who came to me in the first session, identified 15 of these qualities. They want to be motivated, focused, engaging, confident. And then we did about 6 sessions where they really explored this and started to understand about what was important to their performance and to really engage, like we talked about with peak performance, be able to actually really engage with their performance. And then these sort of qualities change. So within 6 sessions, actually, they'd refined it down to about 5 qualities that were important to them and that they could really focus on. So when you're preparing for your performance, it's shifting. We have a sort of finite amount of attention. And if you're focusing on all the things you don't want to happen and the worries and anxieties and concerns, it's likely that those things are going to happen. But actually, if you shift that and say, I want to be confident, I want to be focused, in order to be confident, as a musician, I might need to stand or have my shoulders back, touch the ground, feel my violin in a specific way, or a sports person think about their footfall on the track, or again, that sort of physical sensation. So for me, it's very much about focusing on what you need to do to be able to perform well. And then, but you also at the same time have to think about why have you got that worry about being good enough? Where's that come from? And also then start to address that. So for some people, it might be a coach growing up said, you're never going to be really good at this, or you're too short, you're not going to make it, or a jockey, you're too tall, you're not going. Sometimes that is the case. But again, see a lot of people overcome these challenges. But often so a coach has said something that is perhaps a flip comment to the coach or something they've just thought or said, but that can stay with that athlete for years. I've worked with musicians and athletes in sport that have 20 years, they've carried this belief around that they're always going to struggle with certain parts of their performance, or they're always going to get anxious or nervous. Again, an athlete I worked with recently had a coach that said about 20 years ago about a particular technique, that's something you're just never going to be good at. And we really discussed that and said, actually, do you want to hang on to that belief now? Because now's your moment to actually say, that was what that coach thought 20 years ago, but look at where you are now. Do you want to hang on to that belief and let it keep impacting your performance? Or can you let that go and start to think, actually, I am good enough. This is part of my performance. This is something I can do. This is part of where I'm progressing to. Yes, I think for me, it's being able to look at things from lots of different, when you're talking about anxiety or peak performance, it's looking at or managing a belief. You've got to look at lots of different sort of perspectives to be able to really address it fully. Sometimes people would just talk about doing, if an athlete's anxious, a coach might say, well, just do some breathing or a relaxation technique. And that can help in the moment. But then the next time you perform, you're probably going to feel the same anxiety or a few performances down the line. So for me, it's about that work that takes time and energy and effort to make these changes. But anybody can do that as well.
Yeah, really interesting how you kind of split it up into those 2 avenues, and agree with you 100% in the sense that if our brain and mind is constantly creating this sort of anxious experience in the future. Every time we think about a moment in the future, our brain creates a kind of representation, a reality, and with that comes an experience. Every time we imagine ourselves feeling anxious in that moment, we neurologically train our mind and body to be anxious in that moment. And we have this self-fulfilling scenario. But then we also have that self-fulfilling scenario if we don't deal with the deeper layers of the onion that are creating those thoughts in the first place. We're going to keep creating those thoughts. And how would you, just sticking with the first one, and then maybe we'll move on to the second one, how would you help direct someone's attention? You talked about having such a limited bandwidth in any given moment. What are some of the techniques that you might use to work with someone?
I think it goes, again, if we're talking about sort of being good enough, because that's something that comes up time and time again across all sort of areas of performance. I think for me, I would say to a performer I was working with, there's two ways of doing it. For some people, it's actually saying there's no such thing as good enough. It's an abstract concept where often people hold over themselves. I need to be good enough. But actually, when you say, but what does good enough look like? For some people, again, if you relate that to your performance, you could say, what does good enough look like for you to be able to perform today in this situation? That can really work for some people. And they can say, actually, I need to be able to remember the music. I need to be able to engage. I need to have my shoulders relaxed. So you think about what are the processes you need to focus on. For some other performance, actually, it can be just acknowledging that actually I am good enough. I'm good enough right now. There is no such thing that I'm aiming for this kind of good enough that we hold over ourselves, or other people judge us, or coaches say, sort of hold this. You need to do this well, or you need to achieve this, or you need to get that medal, or you need to be able to deliver this performance. And I think a lot of the time people feel like there's this sort of level we're all aspiring to in terms of our performance, or in terms of being people that, we're going to get to this level where everything's going to be okay. And if you get this gold medal, I'll be okay. Or if I get that job, I'll feel okay. But life is always changing, and there isn't that place that we get to where everything is good enough. So some of the clients I work with in the session, I really challenge them and say, hang on a sec, you are good enough. You look at what you're doing, look at the person you are. Look at what you're able to do look at you as a human being as well as the athlete that you are. You are good enough. And that really comes back to self-esteem as well. So for me, if I'm looking at helping people develop their self-esteem, that taps into that kind of good enough. You are good enough as a person. That doesn't mean you become complacent and you just go and perform and think in a mediocre way. That really enables people to then be able to engage and deliver, because they're not worrying. They're not got that kind of niggle in the background of their mind saying, what are you doing? What are people going to be thinking about you? Don't make a mistake. Really, everyone's so unique. So it depends on the individual person. But people find that really hard often if they've been brought up with this needing to be good enough kind of fear and belief. They can find it very hard to actually stand there and say, I am good enough right now for what I'm doing today. And that's what, if you can sort of get up each day and say that, the way you approach the day is going to be hugely different to worrying about every situation you're coming up against.
And what, in your experience, do you feel helps that individual crystallize that belief change? I imagine there's people listening to this who kind of go, yes, I know I need to change this opinion. I realize I've got a self-limiting belief, or I realize that this is holding me back, but I just don't know how to believe what I want to believe, or I don't know how to increase my self-esteem. What in your experience have you found is that kind of difference that makes the difference, that enables that switch to happen?
I think it's potentially talking, you don't have to work with a performance psychologist, but talking to friends even, or if you're in sport, talking to coaches or other athletes who are around you who have been perhaps in a similar you or are performing on the stage, for example. And I think for me, it comes back to, thinking about what it is or why you've got those beliefs, but also then thinking about actually you have to really spend some time just trying to tap into where that belief has come from. And again, that might sound complicated, but just actually stopping and reflecting, getting a pen and paper and making some notes about where that belief has come from can be really helpful. And then thinking, actually, what can I change that to? So if you've got a belief that, for example, that you need to be able to, you're worried about what people think. So say you're a singer, and whenever you go on stage, you're worried about getting reviews. You know there's a reviewer coming in, you're worried about the reports you're going to get, or social media, for example, which is huge, obviously, for everyone now. You have to really think about what's behind that. How can you change that belief? And that's why I say there's no one sort of magic thing. So if you think about a reviewer coming in, you might say, today's just another performance. The fact that there's a reviewer in, it could work that actually you say, that's brilliant, because this gives me a chance now to show what I can do. That won't necessarily work for everyone. So for somebody else, it could be there's a reviewer in the audience, but actually if there's 1,000 people watching you, 999 people are here. There's just one reviewer, and I can take it, so I can put that into context. So it's thinking about what, and you will hear if I use the TIMP model quite a bit. I work with Professor Steve Peters, and with the TIMP model, think about that emotional team in your brain. What I'm doing with that is you're trying to find something that emotional team in your brain will buy into. So it's the emotional team in your brain that's often saying, you need to be good enough. What's the reviewer going to say? What if you get slated on social media? What if people don't like my performance, for example? Then you have to think, actually, and you try different things out. And if things don't work, then it's about saying, actually, that doesn't work. What can I try next? And you will feel it when you get the right, I call them truths. So they're like factual statements that you say to yourself at that moment. And you can feel it when you get it right. And I can see it if I'm having a session with a client, I can see if the client's not, they're saying, yeah, that sounds good if you're trying a new belief. And you can tell it's not. And I'll say, well, try it out and let's see if it works. And then they come back and say, no, it didn't work. So then we try something else. And you can really see that sort of penny drop moment when you get it right. And that will work. Again, that's not to say that's going to be the statement that you use at that moment in time forever. For some people, it might be an image as well, an image that comes to mind that helps grounds you, gives you that perspective, changes that belief, your sound or anything. So it's trying things out. And I think anybody can do that. Things like visualization can really help as well. So visualizing yourself in that moment, but coping with it using the statement, managing yourself in that situation, things like that can be really helpful.
Yeah, it's amazing what resonates with different people. And sometimes it's the most creative thing the individual comes up with. As a coach or support person, you might have an idea in mind, and when they own it and find something that resonates, it's no matter how creative the example or the image can be, if it's impactful, that's important.
Yeah, definitely. But it's about helping the individual find that. And I think, again, it's always in all the work I do, and I think for people helping themselves, there's no sort of magic wand, or there's loads of tools and techniques and tips we can give people. But at the end of the day, you've got to try things out and see what works for you individually and see, and again, and what doesn't. And you can really start to just explore thinking about performances. What was the time I performed well? What was the build up to that? What was I focused on? How had I prepared? Things like that. So again, you can start to really help yourself by just tuning into how you're preparing when things go well or if things go wrong, just rather than getting cross or frustrated, actually just think things went wrong. That's okay. Let's think about why that was, what I can change, how might I look at preparing differently or approaching a competition differently next time, what can I change? And try out. And there's this journey that's evolving as a performer. Your performance is always changing and developing and moving, and it's this constant dynamic process. And for me, it's always about trying things out and seeing what works and not being afraid to take that risk to try something. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. Try something else next time.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because having that experimental approach to the solution, I find really, really important to not only take away the need for it to have to work and the expectation, which adds more stress around it, but also the nature of performance psychology or mental skills coaching, where I'm always amazed by how much time, effort, and money people put into physical advancements, technical advancements, and a natural kind of expectation of a physical enhancement might be, well, I've just got to go out and experiment. I've got to try, leaping up with my left foot or leaping up with my right foot, or I go out and try it and give it a go and then come back and find that sweet spot. And often when people try to apply some kind of mental support or kind of mental skills to their activity, there isn't necessarily that same patience a lot of the time. And the time and money we attribute to actually implementing those solutions on a psychological or mental basis are often a fraction of what someone might do otherwise. And so when we have that experimental approach, that really allows us to kind of breathe life into that.
Yeah.
How have you seen over the years, you being one of the first performance psychologists working with UK sport and Olympic teams, and out of so many years, how have you seen that uptake or the progression and the acceptance of people seeing the rise of the mental game being an integral part of our training?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think I suppose I've been involved as about 25 years now, and it's changed hugely. When I think back to when I left racing and went into performance psychology or sports psychology, as I was focused on then, it was still very new. People didn't know what to expect. And I think it was at that point, sports psychology had a lot of criticism, which I would agree with, for being much too academic. So the top people who were sports psychologists tended to be professors based in universities who did some applied work, but everything was very much more academically based, which isn't a bad thing. But I think, again, it was making that transition to being more applied and for people to be able to understand it, not this sort of mystique that it's almost had about itself initially. But I remember when I finished my PhD, I started my own consultancy company. And a couple of years into that, I applied for the job as sports psychologist to UKA, the UK athletics Olympic team. And I got the role. And I still remember I was so pleased. It was like my dream role. And I went into, it was just it was in 2007. So we had Beijing Olympics coming up the following year, and then 2012 in 5 years' time. So there was a huge amount of money being ploughed into bringing all the sports science support teams into working in these big athletics centres. So the coaches had been used to doing their own thing with their teams, and suddenly they had to come into these big centres and use all the support staff team, which sounds brilliant, but there was a lot of resistance from the athletes and coaches, because this was something very new and different. And I can still remember going into the stadium on the first day, beaming away, thinking everyone's going to come up and think I'm amazing and want to work with me. And about 3 coaches came over to see me and said, "Don't take this personally, but I don't want you even speaking to my athletes, let alone thinking you're going to be able to start working with them." So that the first year I spent by the side of the chatting to the coaches to get them on board and to get them to understand that I wasn't this scary person that was going to start trying to control their athletes, and then working. The athletes are much more receptive. It was interesting. It was the coaches and a lot of the other people within the sport that were more resistant to the input. But when I think now, I think you'd be very surprised to meet any Olympic or professional sports person in the UK that isn't working with a sports psychologist at some level. And also, I love going to the theatre, and there's a play that came out recently at the National Theatre last year, and that was about the England football team. It was called Dear England, about Gareth Southgate and his time with the England team, but also Pippa Grange, the sports psychologist, had a key role in this play. So this was in the theatre talking about the England football team, and it was interesting that the sports psychologist had a key role in the play as well. So I think you could see just quite how far it's come now as well.
Everybody will feel anxious about different situations. This fact is obvious. Yet most people tend to ignore or deny this anxiety until it develops into something very distractive, overwhelming, or even a psychological issue. Psychological studies even show that up to 35% of elite athletes suffer from a mental health crisis. For example, Dr. Margot Putoukian from the Department of Athletic Medicine, the University Health Services at Princeton University, reported that 33% of injured athletes reported high levels of depressive symptoms, and 27% of non-injured athletes still reported issues with depression. Yet, despite this prevalence, even those performing at the pointy end, who rely on their mental ability for their career, often don't prioritize their mental health or inner game, and don't see it as important as their physical health or physical progression. In the general population, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare state that 43% of the population have experienced a mental illness in the past, and 22% of the population is experiencing it in the last 12 months. With anxiety disorders affecting 31.9% of adolescents between 13 and 18 years old, and children at the age of 5 reporting problems with anxiety. This means that someone you know, and potentially someone you love, is likely struggling with anxiety and their mental health. Our inability to effectively manage our mind stares us in plain sight. Yet, it is continually overlooked, underestimated or denied and ignored. It's often called a silent disease, as many people struggle alone and do not ask for help. In fact, the World Health Organization estimates that close to 2/3 of mental illnesses go untreated. Many cases even go undiagnosed.
Flow Unleashed.
Yeah, it fascinates me that culture around the fear of having psychological support. You know, I still work with athletes who want the relationship to be anonymous because they're worried about being reprimanded by their coach, because their coach might have a command and control leadership style where, you know, they want everything to either be done in-house or they want to be the one sort of having the power to make any change. And the focus necessarily isn't on the individual's optimal human functioning, but rather than, you know, the coach's ability to command and control. And, you know, I also have a look in relationships, you know, something that means so important to us, like a loving relationship with our partner. Many people are afraid of seeking external help, you know, for that relationship, or seeing a psychologist to help with something that's so important to us, in the fear of where that will go. Have you seen over the years that fear disappear or break down? And if so, what do you think's really helpful?
Yeah. I think it has. I think a lot of it has been just performance psychologists being more in the media, or psychologists across all aspects. And I suppose things like social media, where people are posting all the time or uploading videos on what performance psychology is about. So, and also I think for me, there's two things. One thing is that very much mental health has become huge now. So there is a huge focus on mental health and mental well-being, which is brilliant. But I would say, my work, I'm not a clinical psychologist. My work is very much focused on performance. So I can help people with anxiety to a certain level or depression to a certain level, but I'm not a clinical psychologist. And I think that's the difference. In the past, people tended to think a sports psychologist, you had to have a problem or a mental illness to go and see a performance psychologist. Whereas I think what we've got much better at helping people see is actually we're there to help you perform at your best, to get that extra 5% that you want to get. We're to be able to tap into that peak performance, not because if you're suffering from depression or anxiety, there's a huge need for psychologists to work in that area as well. But I think what I try and do in my work is very much focus on, and that was what got me through with the, initially with some of the coaches at UK Athletics and some of the other Olympic sports I've worked in, was actually saying people don't need to have a problem or a challenge or a mental health issue to come and see me. I can work with you and your athlete to help them tap into that 10% that they're struggling to find, or we can help them look at how they're approaching their training or how they're approaching their competitions. And I think that's where you can start to break things, that there's not something scary about what I'm doing. It's about working together, and I haven't necessarily got all the answers, but we can work together and try and see the areas you want to improve on and you want to work on, and think, how can we actually work on that together? And I think, being quite honest, I always say to coaches and athletes, I haven't got all the answers. I bring my sort of tool bag with me of performance psychology skills, but you're the expert athlete, you're the expert at coaching, and we work together to try and help move things forward and make the changes you want to make. But I haven't got all the answers, and again, it's I come with my toolbox and we work together to move things forward. I always say to any performer I'm working, I don't help, I can advise, I can support, I can be a sounding block, but at the end of the day, that performer has to make those changes themselves, or things will only change very short term. They have to want to make the changes. And I've sometimes worked in a sport, or I remember I worked in for an investment bank for a few years as well, and often I'd get people sent to see me who didn't want to come and see me, but their manager had said, go and see Anna and have a session. And I would always be very clear with everybody. We'd have a session. I'd explain a bit about what I could do to help. We'd look at the areas they perhaps were wanting to make changes in. But I would always say at the end of the session, you have to go away and think about if this is something you want to do. And you have to come back to me and say, actually, yes, this is something I want to do. Because if you're coming because your manager's told you, or you have to be here, it's going to be hard to make those changes. And I think when I first started out as a performance psychologist, I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that. I'd have been desperate to win the person over to work with me and make those changes. But now I can take that step back and say, actually, you need to want to make the changes yourself. And sometimes you have to work with somebody who's paying you to work with somebody, and you have to do that. And again, that's a different scenario, but but usually if people are resistant, again, there's something there that they're afraid of or worried about or concerned about or they're fine and they don't need the support.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at how sometimes I might be sitting across a dinner table, or it could be in a casual setting, not a professional setting, and they come across the fact that, I work in this mental space, and they suddenly go, oh, you're not reading my mind, are you? There's this sort of fear and expectation that if you talk to someone in the capacity that you'll open a can of worms and you won't be able to put the can back in its place. And I think it's so important, the words you said of, often the intention really with the professional is to help people find their own answers rather than necessarily give them answers, because it's more empowering that way and more sustainable in terms of the solution. But often we do have to find our own answers.
I often find if you're working through something with a client, writing things down. So I often work with a whiteboard. So if I'm working all my client sessions, they generally have a whiteboard there or flipped chart, and we write notes as we're going through the session. And that can be again, we were talking about changing beliefs and things like that. So again, I'll often put, if somebody's got a belief they want to change, I'll just put it on the whiteboard and we'll just brainstorm ideas around that, and seeing it written down there again and I can often think, well, I know what I would how I would change this belief, or I can see what they need to do, but you've got to take that step back and let them find that. And sometimes it can take several sessions of them just processing and brainstorming and thinking, but it's allowing that client that time to do that themselves, and you can guide them. And I will often ask questions where, obviously, I'm sure you do this where you know the answer, but you want them to think about the process, or want them to think or challenge themselves. Because when people actually voice their emotions, when we talk about how we're feeling, or we talk about anxieties or worries, we're actually processing that. So if I think about the chimp model, again, with that, you're using your logical, rational brain. You're allowing the emotion, you're talking about the emotions, and your rational, logical thinking brain can listen into how you were feeling. So again, I think for me, that process and that's something anyone can do. It's, you can brainstorm that yourself and think through actually how was I feeling at that moment? Why was I feeling anxious? And how would I like to feel? And what could I say to myself at that moment to change that?
Yeah, and as a professional, so important to give that space and time for individuals to have that processing. Because if we kind of try to jump to the solution too quickly, that processing doesn't happen, and then we don't get that integrated change that inhibits them finding themselves in the same position a little bit later. Do you want to help others unleash their performance? Do you want an internationally recognised accreditation to stand out amongst the crowd? Or do you want the playbook I use every day when helping professionals to be their best? Join us at my training organisation, the Flow Centre. We are on a mission to train a fellowship of expert practitioners to work with us and help make the world a better place. And whether you want to join the Flow Centre team as a flow coach, or continue your professional leadership development, or integrate these valuable skills into your organisation and team, go to flowcentre.org today. You mentioned the chimp model quite a few times, and it's quite a famous model by Steve Peters and colleagues, where we have this inner chimp that distracts us from what we want to do. And what have you learned from work? You were the managing director there for several years. What have you learned during your time working predominantly with that model? And what are the main benefits someone could take away from adopting that model?
Yeah, I think when I first met Steve, probably in around 2007, he was doing a presentation to all the English Institute of Sports psychologists in the build-up to Beijing, I think, and he was talking about the chimp model back then and just sort of really developing it. And I suppose what jumped out at me was initially, and then with working with him after that, was just having a model which is like a tangible way of looking at how your brain works. So with the chimp model, Steve talks about we have 3 teams in the brain. So you have an emotional thinking team, which is developed even before we're born. And that's an automated system. So it's not within our direct control. But that's where it has things like the fight, flight, freeze. It's there to keep us safe and keep us alive. But it's a very reactive sort of system. And that's what Steve calls your inner chimp. So it's this emotional thinking that sort of uses emotion to function. So it doesn't use truth or logic, and it's very quick to respond. So if a lion burst into the room next to me here, that emotional thinking team in my brain would either fight the lion, hide under the table, or run out of the door. Are going to fight, flight, freeze mode. And we need that. We need that to be able to. The other team, which is what Steve calls the human, which is the rational, logical thinking team. This doesn't really start to develop till we're probably about 2 or 3 years old. And so when children are first born, they're using this emotional thinking system most of the time. And that's where they are often you can see that they're very reactive, responsive, often aren't able to put things into perspective or context. And this other team, the human team, which Steve defines as the human, this is your rational, logical thinking team. And it develops around 2 to 3. So you often will see with children, they'll suddenly start to say things like, why can't I eat chocolate for dinner? Why does the sun go down at night? And they're starting to, this rational, logical thinking team is starting to develop. And it's where we have things like executive functioning, where you can put things into perspective, into context, and also our morals and values. So that's the real you. So that human, that rational, logical thinking team is the real you. So when I said before about if somebody comes in to see me about feeling anxious, for example, and I say, well, actually, how do you want to be as a performer? What I'm doing there is giving them the space to shift the blood flow to that rational, logical thinking team, the human, to actually think about how do you want to be. If you're away from an emotive situation, you can take that time to use that system to say, actually, I want to be professional, I want to be focused, I want to be engaged, I want to be motivated, I want to be relaxed, whatever it is. Again, so really and then the third system is what we call the computer, and that's where you store your automated beliefs, where you have automated programs. So if you're performing in peak performance, you're using a program that's stored in that third team, the computer. And I think sometimes the model gets criticized for being how does the blood flow move around? Because that's what you're talking about, shifting the blood flow between these 3 teams in your mind. But actually it's about, they're very integrated. And it's about understanding when you might need to use that emotional thinking team and when you might need to use the human team and when you need to be able to quieten your chimp to allow the blood flow to be in the computer if you're, say, performing and you want to be programming your computer. So if you think about learning to drive, for example, you're using that human team for that. So again, you're having to consciously process learning a new skill or learning to drive, for example. And that's slow and clunky. It's not a fast system. And then when the more proficient you get at driving, that then becomes a sort of automated program that would be stored in your computer. And then you can drive a car and listen to the radio or talk to somebody. And again, you have that as an autopilot running. But you also store beliefs in your computer. So that's when I'm helping an athlete or client change a belief. Again, we have to, I say, reprogram that computer team in your mind. So you've got to change, what you're doing is actively removing that belief that you had and replacing it with a more helpful one, as we talked about a bit earlier as well.
How does the model overlap with the science around dual cognition?
Yeah, I think I've always tended with the model to use it in a more, I think it can, because again, you think about 2 systems, this reactive emotional system that's not within your direct control as well. And I think that was a key thing with the model that was different, that Steve brought this idea that there's a system, this emotional system in your brain that you don't have direct control over. And that's what really jumps out at a lot of people that are new or come across the model for the first time, is recognizing that in any situation, the blood flow will go, first of all, to this. If you're in an unusual situation, the blood flow automatically goes to that emotional thinking system first that you don't have direct control over. And that's why people often get frustrated when they say, I want to lose weight and I've planned my diet. And then you go to a restaurant and you say, right, I'm going to the Pizza Express or any pizza shop and I'm going to order the salad. And the waiter comes over and you order an extra large pizza with added toppings. And again, that's because the human team has often thought about, I'm going to be on a diet and I'm going to have the salad, but in the heat of the moment, the blood flow goes to that emotional thinking system. And if you haven't primed that ready to react differently, you're probably going to react in the same way and order the pizza. And that for some people, it's a huge relief to realize that, why have I struggled with this for years? Why haven't I just been able to go and order that salad? And recognizing that actually there's a system in your brain that's not within your direct control, but you can learn to understand and you can learn to manage, can be a huge relief for a lot of people. And the same with performance. Sometimes performers saying, I don't understand why I worry about making a mistake, or I don't understand why I always get nervous, or I don't understand why I beat myself up if I've had a bad performance afterwards, because it's not helpful, but I can't stop myself doing it. And recognizing that, again, there's this system that you have to actively learn to understand and manage, and then be able to reprogram your mind. And some people, again, as we talked about before, are naturally quite good at doing that and perhaps haven't struggled with it. And other people have struggled all their lives. And, you can see the relief in some people's face in just understanding and recognizing that, and then being able to work with it. And I think for me, the model brings that. You're not just talking about something abstract. It doesn't resonate with anyone by any stretch, but for some people, actually, rather than talking just about a thought or feeling, thinking, I've got these 3 teams I need to understand and learn about my unique team. What's my chimp like? What's my human like? What's in my computer? That can give people a really solid construct to work with and make it much more manageable. We talked about before, being things feeling scary or being afraid of, working with a sports psychologist or something like that. But I think for some people, the model brings that sort of reassurance of something tangible and concrete. But it is just a model, and there's not much. Steve's done some research recently to support it. So I think it's very much a part of my toolbox, rather than when I worked with Steve, we had to sort of use the model in all our work. And it's still very much a part of my toolbox, but I dip in and out of it more now. And if it resonates with people, then I think it. And I certainly use it on myself. It works. That was one thing that really drew me to the model. It resonated with me as a way of understanding my mind, I think. And also being able to, I use my sort of, every morning I do a bit of a mental warm up for the day and use aspects from the chimp model, definitely, with that. And think about, again, with when you can really bring that chimp, that emotional team to life. And I think for some people, again, thinking of it as a chimp or a part of them that you can get to know and get to work with. So again, rather than being overwhelmed by anxiety or fears or concerns, thinking, actually, this is something inside my mind that I can get to know and work with, and that actually it's not something that's overwhelming or something to be scared of. It's something that you can bring on board and work with. So I think people often talk about, boxing your chimp in or controlling your chimp or getting rid of your chimp, but it's not. It's about understanding it and getting it to work with you.
Making friends with your chimp.
We need that chimp system. But it's just understanding it and working with it.
Yeah, I can certainly see how the model allows self-compassion, and allows us to kind of diffuse from our thinking and maybe not place so much identity on our thinking and kind of reactionary behaviors, and not beat ourselves up. And how would the model explain peak performance or flow?
I'd say it would be using your computer, a program in your computer. So the chimp being quiet and happy, so it's not niggling away or distracting But then it's very much about using that program in your computer. So when you're tapping into what you need to focus on to be able to perform at your best. So you wouldn't want the human involved. That would make you very conscious. That would take you back to a very conscious performance state. Sometimes you want your chimp involved a little bit. So some performers I work with, particularly on stage or in some sports as well, because your chimp has this sort of worries about what other people think often, but equally wants to show off, wants to be the best, wants to demonstrate superiority for some people's chimp. So for some performers, they might use that on stage. So they actually draw on their chimp to come out and help them to be that confident person that they want to be on stage. So it's a chance for their chimp to show off and to embrace that. But again, that's the chimp you're working with the chimp to come into the performance, but the main part of the performance would be using a program in your computer. But I think it's not so much, although we're talking about the three teams, it's more about thinking there's one team might be more involved in certain aspects of performance, but essentially it's about you always think about how all three might contribute, or as I said, with the human, not so much for peak performance because that would make it very conscious.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, most of my understanding of neuroscience and neurocognition would be in terms of flow and optimal performance would be them working in synchronicity. That thinking brain or prefrontal cortex holds the focus. The goal at front and center to direct our attention, and then there's trust there between all three entities to allow that supercomputer to actualize the training and actualize our ability. And then that chimp is well trained to use its sort of instincts and intuition to sort of play with novelty in the moment in the fastest possible manner. And there's certainly like a cohesion between all of them. And I guess dual cognition theories would combine the chimp and the supercomputer into one sort of operating system, whereas it's sort of split up there. Yeah, fascinating. Having worked so deeply in a variety of domains, from dance, sport, business, and so forth, how transferable do you feel mental skills learnt in one area is applicable to another area of someone's life?
Yeah, I think 100% really, because any skills that you're learning, I think I don't think of them as being learnt in just around your performance. Though you might be learning it, so you're doing visualization as part of your mental warm-up for a performance. You might actually then start to do visualization if you're doing presentation at work or in the morning, thinking about the day ahead. So I think the skills are very much, I might help somebody to apply them to elite performance or performance, but they do impact across all areas of our life. And I think, again, where I am now as a performance psychologist, I very much work with the whole person. So any work I do with clients is about getting to know them as a person, understanding them as a person, not just performance and issues around performance. And again, I think that's where the chimp model can really help, because if I'm using that model with a client, then the first couple of sessions we're exploring, understanding, getting to know their human, their chimp, and what's in their computers. And again, that's not just related to sport, that's them as a person as well as in terms of their sporting context. I might have some clients that come see me and just have a couple of sessions very specifically focused towards a skill they want to change or improve, or very sports related. But the majority of clients I work with over a period of time will be very much about working with them as a person, not just specific to sport, and getting them to understand themselves as a person. I think that makes a huge difference. A lot of performers often neglect to think about them. They are the athlete or the musician or the actor or the comedian. They're not. For me, it's very much about, first of all, you're a person, a human being, and then it's about also you're a performer. And when clients I work with are very much in the sort of well known and on, in social media, and trying to negotiate that world of social media and reviews and being talked about a lot. That's a key stage for me, is always to take that time with them to say, first of all, you're a person and a worthwhile person, and then you're a performer, and you have to be able to differentiate between the two. And if you can understand what's important to you as a person and what are your values and qualities as a person, then it doesn't matter what people say about you on social media. That's about your performance. That's something that you need to manage and you need to address, obviously. But actually, you could still stand up each morning and say, I value myself for these reasons, and I appreciate this is me as a person, and then as a performer, that's a separate. And that if you can do that, then it means you can really maintain your self-esteem. If your self-esteem's caught up in how many likes you're getting on social media, or reviews, or number of ticket sales, or gold medals at the Olympics, then your self-esteem is going to constantly fluctuate depending on what other people say.
I think that's a really important point. You hear more and more in the media of sort of coaches, especially in sort of football, because it gets so much sort of airtime on media around them looking to recruit and pick new players who are great people, not just great performers. And there's this sort of interconnected growth with the more we develop as a human being, the better able we are to have a stronger self-construct, stronger self-esteem, stronger self-worth. We're able to, allow self-efficacy to become more complete quicker, and it adds to our overall performance. Yet there's also many examples of narcissists and egomaniacs and still performing at a very, very high level. And so there's often a hesitation or caution there of, do I really need to develop myself as a human being? Like, I just want to do well at this sport or this presentation, or, why do I have to work on myself? I just want to perform better. And sort of understanding how those two, there is this sort of symbiotic relationship, I think is really important to people's journey of embracing that mental game.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, it's sometimes people aren't ready initially to understand that. So I've got some clients that I've worked with for several years. And again, sometimes you've dropped things in at the beginning around that, and they're just not ready to take that on board yet. And you have to wait till they are ready to really start to understand that and to work on that. And some people still, they need all the time that it doesn't, they post something and get lots of negative comments or feedback or abuse on social media, and you'll still initially feel down about that. And then you have to work through that and then reconnect with what is important. I always want people to say that you've got always have a key group of people close to you that you trust. And that might be your coach, it might be your parents, it might be your partner, but sort of a team of about 5 to 10 people maximum that you trust. Some people, it might be one person even. And anytime you're in a situation like that where things have gone wrong, you've got a lot of abuse, you've got challenging things to deal with, or you've just had a performance or a show, or you've been at the Olympics, always go back to, they're your first sort of team to check in with for your feedback. They're the trusted people that no matter what's happened, you always get feedback from them. And then you can let the rest of the social media and everybody else go, because you've got confidence in your team of people that are close to you, that hold your back no matter what. But they need to be able to challenge you. And, it's not that they just say you're wonderful all the time. They need to be able to give you constructive feedback, but they're the team you can rely on. And if people can really buy into that, they can let go the pressures on social media and the press and everything else. But they have to actively work on that, usually all the time, to remember that.
I'm always fascinated with the question, which I get asked a lot of time, every now and again around, often there's a suggestion or premise that we need to kind of de-layer and strip away our ego, because often that's triggered to comparison and putting us as inferior or superior and triggering that thinking brain to sort of overthink situations, become self-conscious and so forth. Yet there's examples such as Michael Jordan or Muhammad Ali or Cristiano Ronaldo, where one might associate, without knowing them personally, one might associate that there is quite a strong ego there, and they hold the limelight for performance in their domains. What's your thoughts on the need to kind of work with our ego and delayer it to increase our development, increase our personal performance, and those examples who seem to be doing the contrary to that?
For me, it's about understanding, again, the individual with that. Some people can use their ego to push themselves to exceed, to excel. And for other people, that's not helpful at all. And I think, again, going back to the chimp model, Steve talks about that chimp team having innate drives within us, one being the ego drive and that need to us. We naturally compare ourselves to others, and often people, again, some people's chimps have a very strong ego drive, some people's don't. And so for some people, if their chimp has a high ego drive, they're always wanting to show off, they're always wanting to demonstrate superiority. And for me, it's about, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that's how you are, that's how your chimp likes to be. So how do you use that constructively? So for some people, I've worked with coaches in Olympic sports before, where you've had two coaches whose chimps have very high ego drives, and there's a lot of territory battling going on, or wanting to be the more dominant sort of chimp in that situation, particularly around ego. And often it's about understanding that in certain situations, one person's going to be more dominant, and in other situations, the other person is. And if you're perhaps one that has to take a back step, then I would always say, think about, so if you've got quite a high ego drive, but you're working for somebody who also has that, but you need to manage that and not be the one with the high ego drive at that moment, then again, think about other situations where you can use that. So playing a sport aggressively or competitively can be a really good way of using that need to demonstrate that ego drive, but in a constructive way. So if at work you're having to manage that and you can't be using that, then it's about thinking, how do you manage that in other situations, in other ways? Again, I think it's understanding the individual, but also thinking about working with what you've got, changing, but if you have a high ego drive, how to use that constructively, and when might you need to manage that?
What has helped you stay interested in your work and not burn out like many workers and the rest of the planet seem to be doing lots of these days?
I think for me, it's always been, personally, I love what I do. So I think, I've got a real passion for the work that I do. And I think when I first started out, I was probably more chimp driven and ambitious and wanted to work with all the top teams and top performers and to go to the Olympics and to be part of everything. That is important. But I think what I've learned over the years as well is it's actually about that connection with individuals. And, each day I get up, and if I've got one-on-one sessions, no two one-on-one sessions are ever the same, because that each client comes with their unique situation or their unique challenges. I've got some clients I've worked with, as I said, for many, many years, and even working with them, each time I have a session with them, there's something new we're working on, there's something different, there's something that's changed. And the same with any sort of organisation. I love that buzz of going into a new organisation or working with a new client and getting to know them and thinking, how can I help here, and what can we do together? And I think that's what I find hugely rewarding, but also exciting. And I think we're on this journey where life's changing all the time. And, I've worked in sport, I've worked across a lot of different domains. So that's something that has kept things fresh and interesting for me, is often taking on a client in a domain or area that I haven't worked in before and having to really think, how can I approach this? How can I understand this new sport or this performance, this new dance or musician or anything that it is. So I think for me that's it. And also just knowing that everything's always going to be coming back to that, approaching things with what's the new research coming out. I think that the world that we work in is so dynamic and changing, and there's always new ideas and new tools to learn or new techniques. So I've always worked with lots of, like working with Steve for 7 years, I've had lots of different things that I've often drawn on or worked on and then incorporated into my work. So it's kept it fresh and exciting. But I think at the end of the day, it's the thing that's the most rewarding is just working with people. I love people. I love being able to get up each day and work with different people each day and see what the day brings and how I can, help or manage or support or learn myself as well. I think it's that learning that's key as well. Always learning and thinking about new ways of approaching things.
Yeah. When we have the love of learning, every day is interesting and fun. Well, Anna, thank you so much for your time. In coming to the end, we ask every guest 2 questions. One, a film or a book that you feel has impacted you and you'd like to pass on to others, and then a question that you want to put me in the hot seat with.
I'd say actually probably with the book or film, it would be Steve Peter's chimp model, because I think for me, that's not original in terms of what we talked about today. But I think for me, that was something that really changed my thinking and my way of working. And I think gave me sort of more compassion for myself as a person as well. So, yes, I'd say Steve Peter's book.
Time to flip the mic.
We started the podcast with you asking me about peak performance and how I would define it, or what does peak performance mean to me. So I suppose I'd ask you the same question around with your work with flow. How would you define peak performance?
Good question. And, I think there's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to performance, optimal functioning, flow, outcome results. There's objective performance, subjective performance. But for me, I'd sort of, I would define that space where we are actualized best, right? Which comes through that state of flow, and someone might say, oh, that's a peak performance, is where there's complete trust within the individual. And there's this fluidity to our performance. Flow's sort of technically in its most parsimonious form described as an intrinsically rewarding state of absorption in which our high sense of control feels more effortless than normal. And I feel that, there are these gritted times that we push on and we perform really, really well, but it's sort of almost a bit forced and engineered. And that might be someone else's peak performance or a high performance. And we might even win our most epic match during that state. But then there's these moments where everything clicks into place and there's just this inner harmony and it just feels easier. It feels almost like the words were destined to come out of my mouth, or that shot was destined to hit itself. And whilst it's an effortful act, there's an ease and smoothness to what's happening. And for me, that's that moment of flow and an optimal state of functioning. And I find that when we focus on that, then a lot of the distractions and conflicts that ordinarily cloud our mind tend to disappear. We focus all on the process of what we're doing, what we can control. And, so I'm very much aligned with what, you'd laid out at the beginning in terms of really focusing on that personal, optimal state of functioning rather than these sort of performance KPIs or benchmarks or results or outcomes that ordinarily we might focus on.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time. Really good to talk to you.
Thanks, Cameron.
Absolute pleasure. Sometimes it takes a leap of faith to seek out psychological support. The age-old connotations that there must be something wrong with us to seek out help often linger in the archaic halls of institutions, teams, and even our own consciousness. What I found refreshing about Anna's approach was, despite her years of experience and expertise, she still has the patience to individualize each situation, prioritize connection, and see the uniqueness of each person rather than immediately turn to a suite of tried and tested solutions. She didn't buy into the trap that one solution is right for everyone. Practical models are there to be practically related to, or not. If it helps, it helps. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Ultimately, our stresses, nervous reactions, and turbulent preparations are subjective experience, built upon our unique lens and the representation we hold of the world. Our upbringing, culture of origin, family dynamics, experience at school, role models, significant moments, and some of experiences along the way all go towards building a unique tapestry by which we make sense of the world. And it is by deeply understanding these deeper tapestries that any professional can best serve the person they're working with. Taking the time to ask that extra question, listen for a further 5 minutes, or experiment with models to see what resonates with the individual, can all build towards a successful relationship between the coach and the coachee, deepening the trust between the two. Researchers report that regardless of the therapy or coaching profession, the success of all these relationships depend most significantly on the strength of the relationship. The stronger the trust, the stronger the relationship, and the better the results. So if you are seeking help to better your situation, or perhaps want to go from good to great, apply the same patience and experimental approach you would to your physical training. Adopt a get fit mindset approach as you would a get fit physical approach. Try a few people out. See which professional resonates with you. See which one you can build a trusting relationship with. Or if you are a professional, take the time to build the relationship with the client and meet the person where they're at. If you would like to find out more about Dr. Anna Waters, please see the show notes. Thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to get notified when our next episode drops. The more people that subscribe, the better I can make the show for you. Equally, please leave a review. Your review will go a long way to helping others find this pod. Until the next time, thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed.